no. No, they can, but I won't let them slide. We gotta get this dough. Understand we really old enough. Hell no, we ain't old. Just cause we not always close enough don't mean I sold my soul. Out here mapping every day. Every day I make it known. Not out macking every day. Can't be out here going broke. Mapping every day. Mapping every day. LOE back on his way. LOE back on his way. I made about too many K's. I need some M's right on the way. Run the shit back, yeah, rewind, nigga. Rewind, yeah, rewind, nigga. Run the shit back and rewind, nigga. Rewind, nigga.
Map music.